The Kansas City Chiefs have been trying to hide this from us, so we're going to be going through that and other Kansas City Chiefs stories in today's video. So make sure to like this video, and if you want more Kansas City Chiefs news content like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting that red button down below. The Kansas City Chiefs wrapped up their preseason games on Saturday with a 33-32 win over the Cleveland Browns. It was the final chance for the 90 players on the off-season roster to make their case for a spot on the 53-man roster, or possibly an increased role on that roster. As Super Bowl champions, the Chiefs didn't have a lot of spots up for grabs, but several players definitely made the most of their opportunities. While there were a lot of Chiefs that had a strong offseason, I feel like there were a handful of players that improved their stock more than the rest. As I'm writing this, we're still waiting on the official roster cuts. Many of these players weren't expected to have a shot, but their offseason performance has now made that possible. Even if they don't make the initial 53-man roster, you have to think the Chiefs will try to keep them around on the practice squad, and all have them have noticeably raised their stock as NFL players. The first is Justin Ross. I debated putting Justin Ross on this list because some people had sky-high expectations for him at the start of the offseason. That having been said, Ross is still an undrafted player that many originally thought would never be able to play in the NFL at all because of a spinal condition he was born with that was discovered in college. While some of the preseason expectations around Ross were unreasonable, he still managed to meet many of them. He regularly was the buzz of training camp because of highlight reel-type catches he was making in practice. He also produced in the preseason games, totaling 6 receptions for 59 yards and 2 touchdowns. His touchdown this past weekend against the Browns was exactly the type of catch that makes him a fantastic red zone weapon. He elevated above the defensive back and used his long arms to snag the ball out of the air. At this point, everyone assumes Ross is a lock for the final roster, and for good reason. The question is no longer can Ross make the team, but how big of a role will he have? Next up, a player that made a push in preseason to move up the depth chart. In my original roster projection at the start of training camp, I advocated for the Chiefs to only keep Patrick Mahomes and Blaine Gabbert on the 53-man roster. My reasoning was that if Mahomes and Gabbert were injured, I didn't see them trusting Buechele to run the offense. My thought was that they would likely try to bring Chad Henne out of retirement if that happened. I never even really considered the possibility that Buechele would challenge Gabbert for the number 2 role. However, that seems to be exactly what happened. Again, as I'm typing this, we don't know who made the final roster or which quarterback will be listed as the primary backup. But the Chiefs were clearly open to Buechele earning that job based on how they played him ahead of Gabbert in the final 2 preseason games. Buechele struggled a little against the Browns on Saturday, but his overall preseason performance was solid. He ended up 29 of 45, 64.4%, for 349 yards, 7.8 YPA, with 3 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. We'll see just how much faith the Chiefs have in Buechele in the coming days, but he definitely deserves this spot on the list for his push this preseason to become Mahomes' primary backup. Next up, I'm going to cheat the list a little and do a 2-for-1 at number 3. The Chiefs have drafted defensive backs extremely well over the past few years. Because of that, the Chiefs entered camp with a slew of young drafted DBs such as L'Jarius Sneed, Trent McDuffie, Joshua Williams, Jalen Watson, Brian Cook, Nazeeh Johnson, Shamari Connor, and Nick Jones. You throw in a trio of veteran safeties in Justin Reid, Mike Edwards, and Deon Bush, and I just didn't see any possible way KC would have room to consider a single other defensive back. Well, I was right that they wouldn't consider another corner. Instead, they now have to be considering 2 other corners. I don't know if either Ekau Boye-Doe or Khalif Hailasi will be able to fight their way onto the 53-man roster, but they deserve a major tip of the cap for how hard of decision they have made this for KC. Boye-Doe and Hailasi both look like guys most teams would want to have as their developmental 5th corner on the roster. That's what makes this so hard. Both players have shown enough in camp and the preseason that KC has to be worried a team with less defensive back depth will be happy to scoop either of them up. So what will the Chiefs do? Is 7th-round pick Nick Jones in danger of being beaten out? Will they keep 6 corners? If either happens, will they use the spot to keep Boye-Doe or Hailasi? Do they like one or both of them enough to consider trading away one of their other young corners? It will be very interesting to see what the Chiefs decide to do with both of these exciting young corners. Next up, the wide receiver that just won't go away. The Kansas City Chiefs came into this offseason with a sizable portion of their wide receiver snaps up for grabs. The departures of Juju Smith-Schuster and Mecole Hardman meant that the Chiefs had multiple openings in their starting rotation. Marquez Valdes-Scantling is penciled in as one outside starter, but the rest of the wideout snaps were open for Kadarius Toney, Sky Moore, Rashee Rice, Justin Ross, Justin Watson, and Richie James to compete for. The only problem is that nobody apparently told Ihmir Smith-Marsette that he wasn't one of the guys fighting for those snaps. Throughout the preseason, Smith-Marsette was constantly making big plays. He ended the preseason with an impressive stat line of 9 receptions for 194 yards and 2 touchdowns. Even against backups, averaging 21.5 yards per catch is enough to turn some heads. Smith-Marsette also has special teams upside as a potential punt returner and on coverage units. Once again, he is someone who seems like an ideal 5th or 6th wideout on a lot of NFL rosters. The problem for the Chiefs is, if Toney is healthy, Smith-Marsette is the 8th wideout for them. While many fans are clamoring for him to make it over Justin Watson, the coaching staff loves Watson, and he's been running ahead of Smith-Marsette all offseason. Richie James has looked good too as a possible receiver and as the primary punt-kick return man, so finding a spot for Smith-Marsette feels impossible. Regardless of what happens with Smith-Marsette when the final roster is set, he has earned this spot on the list for elevating himself far above what Chiefs fans thought of him and making this a very difficult decision for the coaches and front office. Finally, my top spot goes to the guy that ignored all the hype his primary competition was receiving, kept showing up and making plays, and may have earned himself one of the final roster spots on the team. When training camp started, there was no running back with more buzz around them than undrafted rookie Deneric Prince. Prince was the talk of social media as he was getting snaps with the first team and reportedly looking great both running the ball and catching it out of the backfield. Not only did it appear he was easily ahead of Lamical Perine, but the real question was if Prince would pass up Clyde Edwards-Helaire for the number 3 running back spot. There was only one problem for Prince. When the preseason games rolled around, he was significantly outplayed by Perine. It wasn't just one game either. In all 3 games, Perine was clearly the better and more productive back, despite playing behind worse offensive lines at times in the first couple of games. The Chiefs clearly saw things the same way because late in camp, Perine moved ahead of Prince in the practice rotations as well. This last game was what really sealed things for Perine. Running ahead of Prince, he put up the best performance by a running back in the Chiefs' preseason against the Browns. He had 4 carries for 32 yards, 8 yards per carry, and 3 receptions for 44 yards and 1 touchdown. Not only did Perine prove he is better than Prince right now and show he deserves a roster spot, but he looked like a guy that Casey could actually turn to if guys like Isaiah Pacheco and Jerick McKinnon miss time. Could Lamical Perine actually be the guy that could make Clyde Edwards-Helaire expendable? We'll have to see how rosters shake out. But Perine bumped his stock as much or more than anyone else on this roster throughout the preseason. So there you have it, Chiefs fans. Those are the players who improved their stock the most from the offseason through the preseason games. We'll know who really helped themselves soon enough when the final rosters are revealed, but I don't think anyone can question that these 5, technically 6 players drastically improved their standing with the team throughout the preseason. The preseason has come and gone, and now we turn our attention to cut day and the regular season. NFL teams have to trim their rosters to 53 players by tomorrow, so we'll see a ton of players and preseason standouts find new homes in the coming days. Brett Veach's impressive drafting and talent acquisition has given the Chiefs a deep roster, and simple math means some fan favorites won't make the final cut. Let's look at 2 players I don't expect to make the 53-man roster. The first is Smith-Marsette. He is an impressive blocker as well, notably freeing space for Lamical Perine to score on a screen pass. Unfortunately for the former Iowa Hawkeyes standout, the Chiefs just have too many bodies at the position to feel comfortable projecting a roster spot. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Sky Moore, Rashee Rice, Richie James, Kadarius Toney, Justin Watson, and Justin Ross all seem ahead of Smith-Marsette, and NFL teams typically only keep 6 or 7 receivers. Nonetheless, I expect someone to pick up Smith-Marsette. If not, he feels like a lock to make the practice squad. The second is Prince looked like a lock to make the roster just a couple of short weeks ago, but he's since fallen out of favor with the coaching staff, and it seems Lamical Perine is ahead of him now. An undrafted rookie out of Tulsa, Prince impressed early in training camp with his pass-catching ability and prowess in the return game. That hype didn't translate to the preseason, though, as Prince struggled on special teams and rushed for only 34 yards on 10 carries in the first two contests. Perrine dominated touches ahead of Prince over the last couple of weeks and found the end zone, justifying the coach's decision to play him. The skill set Prince has is a desirable one, though he needs to improve in areas like pass protection to find a spot in the league. I expect him to make a practice squad at worst, as it's clear Dave Toub likes what he brings to the return game. These last couple of weeks haven't been great for Prince, but he's got a bright future ahead of him.